The French president speaking there. Well, for more, we can cross now to Julia Shain, who is a research director at the Counter Extremism Project, which is a non-profit international policy organization. She joins us from New York. Thank you so much for speaking to us. A solemn anniversary today. Of course, Nice, not the first nor the last attack in which a vehicle was used as an improvised weapon. And one report issued by the London-based Risk Advisory Group says that trucks are now the single most lethal form of attack in the West. It's a very difficult weapon to prevent, isn't it?
That's exactly right. So we've been tracking data on vehicular terrorist attacks for the past 10 years, and we found a major uptick in these sorts of attacks, especially since the Nice attacks last year. We found around 36 in North America and Europe and around the world, and there's been a major increase since the Nice attacks last year.
And what do you think has sort of prompted that? What's been the inspiration for that kind of an attack?
Well, ISIS and other terrorist groups have explicitly called for these sorts of low-sophistication terrorist attacks like knife, gun, truck, and car attacks in order to carry out massive amounts of violence with little interception by law enforcement. So they're very difficult for law enforcement to prevent, but there are certainly efforts that we could be taking in order to reduce the threat.
And in terms of the inspiration and where it comes from, do you feel like enough is being done to sort of really cut off the head of the snake, i.e. the source of that kind of inspiration?
Unfortunately not. These sorts of calls for violence are appearing pretty regularly on social media accounts and platforms like YouTube, like Twitter, like Facebook. And despite claims by these companies that they're self-regulating and that they're taking the necessary action in order to reduce the proliferation of this content, we're still seeing that content. We at the Counter Extremism Project, we monitor it every single day, and we continue to see bomb-making videos. We continue to see ISIS's videos on these platforms like YouTube and others.
And so what can be done to stop that?
Well, a couple of things can be done. These companies need to be more transparent. They release press statements every few months after a deadly terrorist attack, after advertising companies pull their advertisements from these companies. And yet what we're still seeing is these kinds of videos appearing pretty regularly on these platforms. So we need transparency, not just the figures that these companies offer, but we need to actually get more details on what content is not being removed. What is the criteria for removal? And we're not getting that yet.
And what about sort of profiling of individuals? I mean, if you look at the profile of the man who carried out the Nice attacks, it's quite a similar profile in many ways, except he was a little bit older perhaps than the average. But otherwise, quite a lot of telltale signs weren't there in terms of he was troubled, he was going through difficult periods in his life, and he was a worry to his family.
That's exactly right. There are certain profiles on these kinds of individuals that apply across the board, and yet it's still very difficult to monitor every single person who's a terrorism suspect. In Europe, there are thousands of terrorism suspects. As ISIS continues to lose territory, we can expect that those figures will rise as individuals from these countries try to return home. And so these law enforcement officials are overburdened in trying to monitor all the potential suspects. And certainly when it's an attack coming from a car, which is a dual-use item, it's very difficult for law enforcement to prevent.
And of course, you are a research director at an organization called the Counter Extremism Project. Just tell us a bit about the sorts of steps your organization is trying to take to counter the threat of terrorism.
Well, we monitor this content on a daily basis. We track these sorts of videos. We flag them for these social media companies. We've also come up with our own technology, eGlyph, which can be used to remove this sorts of content across the board. And we're hoping that these social media companies will step up, will finally take a systematic action that is accountable in order to be able to reduce this sorts of content.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Julia Shain, research director at the Counter Extremism Project. Thank you for joining us from New York.
Thanks for having me.